Hello, class. This PowerPoint will be split into several video lectures, all of which are on the reading of Ta-Nehisi Coates' The Case for Reparations, which should help you complete the research project. The best way to watch the series of lectures and videos will be to compare them with the study guide that you can find on Blackboard. This will help you follow along with the breakdown and help you understand the reading and guide you in the best possible way to complete the research project. So let's talk a bit about our author. Ta-Nehisi Coates is a writer, journalist, and author. He is very prolific. He has written many essays, books, even a few comic book runs on Captain America and Black Panther. His essays and journalism and stories and comics all focus on issues of race inequality in the United States. In terms of the case for reparations, Coates wrote the essay over a 2-year period during which he did extensive research on this essay. He really did a deep dive into this concept. His goal was not to provide a concrete plan about reparations, like how one should go about doing them. Instead, he wanted to make his case like a lawyer arguing for his client, to argue that the case for reparations can and should be made and brought to the consciousness of the United States. So if we look at the strategies Coates uses in writing his essay, you will find 3 key groups. So as you read the essay, you will be able to follow the 3 key strategies Coates uses to make his case. So look for these 3 types of ways he's going to make the argument. One will be through a series of interviews with people impacted by racism in the United States. He might also have interviewed experts of U.S. history in here as well. 2, he will use a lot of historical examples, moments in U.S. history that expose the long tail of racism from slavery to the present day. And 3, statistics and data. He will talk about the statistical impact that racism has had on the life of African Americans, statistics on housing, wealth, and other aspects that overall paint a picture of how racism has impacted African Americans. So as you read, look for these 3 strategies Coates will use: interviews, historical examples, and statistics. So let's begin analyzing the study guide questions. First, let's start with Clyde Ross and what happened to his family in Jim Crow, Mississippi. Clyde Ross begins the entire essay. So, as you know, beginnings are very, very important. So, his story, Ross's story, is an example par excellence, if you would say, that is representative of all of the problems in U.S. race relationship that Coates is going to go and focus on in later parts of the essay. So, Clyde Ross's story is representative of the larger story of America that Coates will go on to analyze in his essay. So, if we look at Ross, we learn that his family owned a small farm in Mississippi, of which they were quite reasonably very proud. However, there came to be a point where Ross's father was claimed to have owed back taxes, which allowed the state to come in and confiscate basically everything that the Ross family owned. Now, a couple of key terms in Clyde Ross's story which will become important and you can look for throughout the rest of the essay. One is the idea of the Jim Crow laws. The Jim Crow laws was essentially the creation of a racial caste system, mainly in the South, but in other states as well, from 1877 to the mid-1960s. So essentially, you can look at the Jim Crow laws as trying to, through legal manners, prescribe ways that would disenfranchise African American citizens. The next key term, which you can find defined in your study guide, is kleptocracy. Kleptocracy is essentially when a government is run on exploitation to favor one group over another. So in the Jim Crow South, we would have a kleptocracy where the laws and the whole system of government was designed to exploit African Americans for the benefit of white Americans. And then we get this story of Ross, this really sad story of when he was 10 years old with his childhood horse, where a group of white men came up and told him, "You can't have this horse, we want it," and then were able to take it as a representative act of a kleptocracy. The next key term is sharecropping. So you may be unfamiliar with this term, sharecropping. Essentially, sharecropping is when someone lives on a stretch of farmland, but they do not own the land on which they live. They pay rent as tenants, and they pay rent off of the crops grown on that land that they sell back to the owner. And then by selling it back to the owner, they pay for their rent, and then what is left over is enough for them to live. This was a system that was rife with exploitation. If you have a landowner that owns the land, owns the crops that come out of the land, but does not own the manufacturing labor, only rents that out, you can see that these rules can be changed to favor the landowner over the sharecropper. And on page 4 of the essay, Coates provides you many examples of how Ross's family in particular got manipulated and exploited from the profits of what they were supposed to be owed. Everything could change, as he says on page 4, on a whim to benefit the landowners. So the system of sharecropping is meant to keep members like Ross's family in a position of servitude and never be able to get enough money to ever escape the system of sharecropping. So, as Ross's story continues, we learn that Clyde Ross joined the Army and later was a part of what in American history is called the Great Migration, which was a movement of African Americans after World War II and before World War II as they went from living in the South to the North. And for Clyde Ross, he was a part of the post-World War II aspect of this migration. So Ross ends up settling in Chicago to take on work and ends up buying his home on contract. So Clyde Ross, as a person, decided to escape a system of sharecropping only to find himself in a system of exploitation that kind of mirrored his family's history as sharecroppers. On contract essentially means that a person purchases a house, but they cannot officially own the house until the entire amount is paid off. So if you were to buy a home for $50,000, in a normal process, you would get a loan. So you would own that home as you pay off the mortgage. On contract means that as you're making payments, you still have no legal claim to home ownership. So the owner can kick you out if you miss one payment or are late on one payment or break some arbitrary rule. And this is essentially what happened to African Americans buying houses on contract. If they made one tiny mistake, one error, late by any amount of time or breaking one arbitrary rule, the owner could kick them out and resell the house to another family. Essentially, if you are buying on contract, you get no benefits of renting, nor any of the benefits of home ownership, but you get all of the responsibilities and risks of being both a renter and an owner. So Ross talks about how, as he escaped this exploitative system of sharecropping, he was caught in just another exploitative scam of on-contract buying. So what happened to Ross when he bought his home on contract? Essentially, Ross could not get a normal mortgage because, as Coates says, Black people across the country were largely cut out of the legitimate home mortgage market through means both legal and extra-legal. So on page 5, Coates tells us that even though Ross had a good job, had a stable job, he could not apply through the normal processes of getting a mortgage because, as an African American, he would be denied that either by some legal technicality or by threats of violence and intimidation. So essentially, there was no choice for Ross but to buy his home on contract. So as a response to this, Ross joined the Contract Buyers League. The Contract Buyers League is explained to you on pages 7 and 8 of the essay. Essentially, this is a group of people that banded together to fight and resist the exploitative practices of slumlord owners. Coates uses the Contract Buyers League as an example of how people can fight for reparations due to them for damages. He says, Ross and the Contract Buyers League were no longer appealing to the government simply for equality. They were no longer fleeing in hopes of a better deal elsewhere. They were charging society with a crime against their community. They wanted the crime publicly ruled as such. They wanted the crime's executors declared to be offensive to society, and they wanted restitution for the great injury brought upon them by said offenders. Essentially, the process of being exploited for years by on-contract buying through the Contract Buyers League's argument created a damage that goes beyond simply changing the laws. The changing the laws may have made this fair, but it would not have addressed the damages to the many, many people who suffered through years of on-contract buying. Something had to be done to make this right more than just changing a law. The next video will pick up on this slide and discuss part 2 of the study guide questions.